about yourself, Mark. Who are you?
So my name is Mark Heffernan, and I'm a teacher at Queen Mary University of London. I teach on a variety of different foundation courses and some in sessionals. And I'm also interested in teacher training and materials writing. And I do that with David.
And how did you get into English language teaching, Mark?
So when I left university a long time ago, my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was she went and trained and did a CELTA, and I'd not really heard of a CELTA very much before. And she spent the summer doing that and then got a job down in London teaching. And I was already living in London. And after a while, I sort of started to think maybe I should do that, but I didn't necessarily have the sort of language background necessarily to do that, because I thought I'd need to be able to speak a second language, and I'm not terribly good at that. And then in, I think, maybe July 2004, I decided to do a CELTA. I booked in on a course, and I've pretty much been teaching since the end of that.
Yeah, looks like we both followed a girl to find our future careers. I started back in 2008. I thought I was going to be a history teacher and wanted to get some teaching experience first, but actually I think I would have been a terrible history teacher, but I think I was a pretty good English teacher. Fell into it, loved it, went to Korea, loved teaching there, and then followed my ex-girlfriend to London, where I started working for EC and never looked back. That's how I fell into it.
So what makes you a good English teacher, or what quality did you think made you a good English teacher?
Oh, I think I'm quite reflective. I think that's one of the most important things for a teacher, for any teacher. But I think, being able to look back at my lesson, think about what worked, what didn't work, what could have been tighter, what I'd do better next time. I think that was maybe one of my strengths, and maybe being able to think on my feet, think of examples. I like, writing stories and things. So I used a lot of stories in my teaching, some of them true, some of them not true, but all of them sort of illustrating the skill or the language.
Some Irish stories.
Some of them old Irish stories, old tales.
The classic exaggeration.
Yeah, a lot of hyperbole. A lot of lies, absolute lies. How about you?
I think one of the things that enabled me to be quite a good English teacher is the fact that I'm not very good at languages. So I think I can empathize with where students have difficulties. And I think that's one of the areas that I think made me able to see where troubles might be in classes, and be able to look ahead and sort of predict that, okay, that exercise is going to need more time than perhaps it looks as if it will need. And I think the other one was creativity. I've always wanted to try different things, and they're not always successful, but you learn by trying multiple different approaches, multiple different things, and trying to find the best path rather than just being the sort of person that sticks with the same thing year in, year out.
Yeah.
And I like challenging myself.
What do you like about teaching, though?
A huge number of things. The cliche answer is I like meeting all the people that you meet in our industry on both sides, as students and as teachers. I think we're quite lucky to work in an industry where a lot of the people we come into contact with are really interesting people. And so there's a lot that you can learn. Outside of kind of language, I love the fact that we work in an industry where very often we're facilitating communication amongst different people. And that in itself is a learning opportunity. And the medium of that is the English language. I love the challenge of it, the fact that the need to think on your feet, as you mentioned. I think that makes it frequently different. You teach the same class twice, but the questions you get asked are invariably going to be different in each time. So I think that's really really interesting and exciting as well. And within the industry and within the teaching spectrum, there's a huge range of what you can end up teaching. So, very early on, I sort of moved over to exams, but I always like to sort of go and force myself to teach lower level classes, which I didn't necessarily think were my forte, but it was always good to improve my teaching. And you do have that ability to kind of to push yourself and to move into different areas. And, then I moved into English for academic purposes and kind of materials writing as well. So I think what I like about teaching is the constant challenge that it can present if you go looking for those challenges. What about you?
I mean, very similar. I mean, I do love the people. I love that the exact same lesson is completely different in two different classes because of the people in front of you. I love meeting new people. I love that a class can change week on week or year on year, depending on the context. But I think most of all, I love seeing and showing progress. I love a student being able to say, I couldn't do it, now I can. That is, for me, that's just gold. If you can show it across a few weeks, a few months, a year, if you can show it like lesson by lesson, that's the trick for me.
I think that's one of the reasons that I loved exam classes, because we're going to speak about this later, but there was such obvious success criteria for seeing where students were. And obviously that's something we're going to talk about, but the need for that and the motivational aspect that can give both to teacher and student, I think is huge.
Yeah. And what about writing? What do you enjoy about writing? How did you get into that?
So I think really so I started teaching in 2004. By 2005, I'd written my first CPD session for my colleagues. The real reason I started writing my own lessons was I was being observed. It was maybe my second observation. And I spent about an hour and a half looking for some material for the class that I knew I wanted to do, because I'd identified an area where my students needed extra practice. And I went through every resource book in the school. And it was a big school. It had quite a lot of resources. So it took a lot of time. And it only dawned on me, because I might be quite stupid, after about an hour and a half, that I probably could have written the class and made my own listening material in the time available. And from there on in, really, a lot of my extra class materials were just things that I'd made myself, because I knew what my students might want. And not all of them were necessarily, by the standard that I would use now, good materials, but they were bespoke for those students and they did meet their particular needs, albeit not necessarily to a level that I would now deem successful. And I think with anything, and particularly materials writing, the way to get better at materials writing is to write materials.
Yeah.
And to do it and to do it and to do it. And then obviously, when you moved back from Spain, we met up and we discussed how we might work together to improve a lesson that you'd made. And that was kind of the start, I guess, of my professional journey. But I already knew that was where I wanted to go. That it was materials development and teacher training that I was really interested in, outside of the existing classroom work that I was doing, that I needed to try and push myself in. Yeah. What about you?
I suppose I never thought otherwise. Like, I've always written, not like, obviously I've used course books and resource books and everything. But I think from the very beginning, I've tried to write a lot of my own materials and worksheets and everything. I just love writing. It never occurred to me that this would be something that I wouldn't do. I just figured everyone must be just writing their own worksheets and lessons and everything like that. And again, I think where I really sort of started honing it was when I first came to London, and there were just so many teaching hours. Like, I'm teaching 37 and a half hours a week. And it's exactly that issue of, I don't have time to go and sift through all the resource books and find the right thing, or spend ages online trying to find the right article or story or whatever, it was so much faster to write my own. And so that was it, just like every morning on the way in, reading the newspaper and saying, which one of these will turn into a lesson? Boom, done. This is it. And turning that into a lesson and sort of gradually honing that format that I could apply to any story, any article, and all of that sort of eventually led into when we started textploitation and exploiting text, because that just was what we naturally did.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And like you say, one of the struggles / advantages of living in London is very often you have a long commute, so you have time to dissect the entire newspaper to find the article that you can.
This was definitely true, yeah.
And they're free, so you can go and grab 20 newspapers,
yeah,
and take them in.
Yeah, it's great. So, Mark, where did overt teaching come from?
So I think this came really almost organically from the writing on textploitation, that we started to realize that a lot of the point of difference with our materials was that we wanted teachers to know the theory behind what they were doing, but we also wanted them to be able to explain that to students. And we found increasingly that we felt that the students didn't necessarily know even some of the things that we did that we take for granted in an ELT classroom. So things like putting students in pairs. And we did a brief survey in, I think, 2017, where we asked students in a range of different classes exactly what they thought was happening there. And we got answers like, the teacher wants us to make friends. Whereas I think for us, the reason that we were putting students in pairs to check answers was to facilitate quicker answers, and so that there was less jeopardy. Students had a chance to check their answers before we did all class feedback, and which, as we know, kind of very often increases the speed with which you get answers, rather than, does anyone want to answer this question? Tumbleweed of silence. And how did it build from there, David?
Well, I think I remember we did our first talk. It was back at EC, actually, the school I was working at, still am. And our sort of visualization was this, the magician throwing back the curtain and letting the audience see what's going on behind. And it was this idea that we wanted to further engage learners in the lesson. And for us, the more we explained to them why we were doing what we were doing in the lesson, the more engaged they were, because they could see the point. It just seemed obvious that no one would be fully invested in something if they didn't know what they were going to get out of it. No one would put their energy into the correct area of it if they didn't know what was being assessed, what was being practiced, what was being taught, or what the teacher was listening out for. So it was that idea of just throwing back the curtain, letting students inside. And we came with this idea of being more overt, because in the past we had observed teachers, and we had been ourselves, but we were saying more covert, sort of hiding things from the students and not feeling they needed to know. This is something, the planning, the mechanics of the lesson, this is for us to understand and for us to plan, but not necessarily for the students. But when we reversed that, we really saw further engagement from those students. And that's where I think it all started for us.
I think another aspect of that is our desire to create autonomous learners. And the more we hand over the locus of control to students, by empowering them with the knowledge of why we're doing what we're doing, they're better able to do a lot of things we'd like them to learn from outside of the classroom. So I think that was almost a side-by-side strand as we were thinking about this, that yes, this is really important to us. This helps facilitate that.
And then I think after coming to this conclusion ourselves, we started to read John Hattie's research into visible learning, and we saw, well, hang on a second, there's a lot of evidence that talking about this stuff in class and engaging students in the objectives really has an impact on their learning. And so those two things went hand in hand and sort of led to overt teaching as we know it today. But what are the central tenets of overt teaching, Mark?
So I would say one of the first ones is, as a teacher, you have to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. What is your goal? What is the process that you're using? In a perfect world, what's the theory that underpins that process? Why have you decided to do this stage of your lesson? and what is the outcome that you would like to see from that. Then once you know that yourself, how are you going to convey that to your students? And that doesn't mean lecturing them and telling them what you're doing. Yes, there might be some learner training involved in this, but very often we find the best way is to elicit from students, getting them to tell us why we're doing what we're doing. It often reveals maybe intentions that we haven't considered that would be useful for students, but it also helps us keep everyone on track. What else, David?
I mean, it's exactly what you said. Like it's a belief that the teacher should know why they're doing. They should have a reason for doing what they're doing. But from the learner point of view, it's just the belief that in a successful lesson, students should know what they're learning. They should know why they're learning it and how it impacts their real life. They should know what good looks like, what success looks like in this situation. And they should be able to make choices about what success looks like for them. There's no two students who are exactly the same in a class. They might be at the same level, but they've each got different strengths and weaknesses. So, overt teaching embraces this belief that they should have ownership over their own personal level of success. I think the final belief is they should get feedback on how well they have achieved their own personal goal. And so I think it's those sort of beliefs for me which underpin. That was where we started. We wanted to create a sort of framework that if you lay it on top of any lesson, this is achieved. Everyone knows what they're doing, why, what success looks like in the class and for them, and how well they've done it and what they need to do next.
I think it's this ability to deal with spiky profiles that we can do by handing over the control to the students. And as you say, allowing them to determine where they want to set their focus and then getting feedback on that specific area that makes it such a useful classroom approach. It's not really an approach, but a way of dealing with students in class, and a way of encouraging them to take ownership of their own learning, not to be basically outsourcing all versions of what is good to us. But if we empower them to know what's good and to make decisions about what they would like to work on and focus on, we can actually get that kind of that dream that used to be discussed all the time when I was a fairly inexperienced teacher of negotiated syllabus.
Yeah, it's that tricky question of what is truly student-centered. Does student-centered mean they're deciding that we're doing the present perfect today? Or for us, I think it means that students are making this, they have an objective, they know how it impacts their life, and they're making decisions about how they're going to approach and reach that objective. And that's, that is really student-centered. They're getting that personalized feedback on decisions they've made, then yeah, it is centered on them. But what impact would this book have on teachers, Mark?
That's a really good question. I think.
Thank you.
So in the dream world, what we would like to see is all of these micro stages in lessons where teachers are having these little conversations. Teachers are highlighting what's happening in this part of the lesson. They're just explaining very briefly why we're doing this, or they're eliciting it from students, and they are highlighting in models, for example, what's good here, what would be improved, how could it be improved. Just this is not a fundamental shift to how people teach. Well, in one sense it is, but in another sense, these are really small little changes that we want to see to lots of things. So that all of this overt way, it's not like one activity that you do. It's a continued thread throughout a class where you are engaging in this open dialogue with your students, but then also, I think crucially, leaving time for your students to reflect on what it is that they want to work on. Because I think with both of those strands, we actually get somewhere near our utopian dream overt classroom.
Yeah, and I really think so. I think all teachers around the world want their students to progress and to succeed, to learn. I think the impact this book could have is there's a lot of things in our industry that maybe, like, for example, just aims and objectives that for many years have been, discussed on either side. Should we do them? Are they effective? Should they be written this way and that way? And there's a lot of like polarizing opinions on these. I think what this book does well is it makes the case for various key stages in the lesson, aims and objectives being one. It makes the case for not just why you should just put it in there, but how it will really impact your learner's success and enable you, the teacher, to have conversations that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise. It makes the case for it, and then it gives you many practical ideas on how you can bring this into your classroom and how you can do it. So I think maybe that's the biggest impact, that we make the case for these important stages, like Mark meant, reflection and everything, as well as giving practical tips on how to incorporate them.
I think that's it. I love the chapter titled From Tick Box to Talking Point, and this idea that almost all of us who've taught, certainly anywhere that's got British Council accreditation, has put their aims and objectives on the board as a matter of course. But a colleague said to us last week that no one had really ever made the case for why. And I hope this book does that it makes the case for why we're doing this, why we think this is a good thing to do it, and why it will be beneficial to classroom practice.
Mm. Would you say that overt teaching is a methodology as such?
No. You mentioned the word earlier, which is that it's a framework that sits over the top, and I think that's absolutely right. I think what we are trying to do is in some ways freer than a methodology, in that, I tend to subscribe to the view that we're all principled eclecticists now in terms of methodology anyway. I think most of us, I lean probably more strongly towards the lexical approach than any other methodology, but that doesn't preclude me from taking bits from TBL. Even within the lexical approach, I'm still a communicative language teacher. That's my basis in training. This doesn't really contradict any of that. It hopefully, as you said, it's a framework that sits over the top and inside of whatever it is that you're attempting to do in your classroom. Because it's not a sweeping change to the way that we teach writing, or a sweeping change to the way we teach listening or reading. What it is an attempt to engender in the teacher this idea that we need to have these micro discussions to explain our intent to the students, and the need that the students have to understand why, so that they can then make informed choices about what success looks like for them, because they understand what we're doing. So we hopefully have their engagement in their learning.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. It's that framework that goes on top of anything. Like, we all, like, even you and I work in different contexts within the industry. Like, there's so many different contexts, different approaches that people have, different ways they have to teach because of their industry, or they want to teach, or they find effective. But our sort of belief, it goes back to our beliefs, is that no matter what you are teaching, your students should know why, what they're learning, how it impacts their life, what success looks like for them, and they should get feedback based on that. And so by setting these little key stages across any lesson, you enable this conversation to happen. And that is the sort of the goal with overt teaching. And I suppose what I've learned from when we're writing the book was that I apply this to teacher training sessions, to workshops that we do, to talks that we do. The goal is all the same. People should know what they're learning, why they're learning it, and they should be getting feedback on it. So hopefully, no matter what your context is, you can apply the ideas in overt teaching.
So this is a question that people often ask at talks is, does this only work with higher levels or adult learners? What do you think about that question, David?
I think that 100% not. Like, this is something that we have, we think everyone should apply to all ages, all levels. Like anything, you can't sort of jump a new way of looking at things in a B1 level and expect people to be able to do it. You need to scaffold that all the way up through the levels and scaffold it all the way up through the ages. My 5-year-old, when he's in class, is aware what he's doing in an activity and what success looks like. This is something that all ages can do. You just lower maybe the language surrounding it. Maybe you use more images to show success. Your expectations are lower. But in terms of knowing what you're learning and why and how you'll be able to do it, I mean, a beginner child can know these things. Whether you're in a monolingual classroom and you decide to choose the language of the class to have some of these discussions early doors and then bring them into English, whatever works. But the framework remains the same, at least for me.
No, I totally agree. And I think this is something that people often think can't happen with lower levels because the language around it can be difficult. But one of my favorite ways of ever having these types of discussions with students whose English level is not yet that high is you give them choices. Are we doing this because of this, or are we doing this for this? Then students are deciding and making the choice. You can say, that's right, we're doing this because of this. You don't ask an open question in that context because you won't get the answer that you want. But you empower students by trusting their world knowledge. Particularly, I think with anyone that we're teaching, in general, they're able to distinguish why in a lot of cases, particularly if you give them choices. They might get it wrong, in which case we can help out and say, well, actually, no, in this time we're doing it for this reason. But it's a powerful tool, I think, for students of all levels, and arguably perhaps even more so at lower levels, because they haven't presumably had the language training. Because let's be honest, we train students in how to learn. So by the time you're at B2 level, you know how a classroom works. You might not know why, but you're familiar with that, and you've to an extent gamified how to do a lot of the tasks in a classroom. So arguably it's maybe even more important at lower levels to teach in this way.
100%. We had one question recently at a talk about continuous enrollment. So students starting every Monday, and the question was, how can you manage this if students are constantly coming in new with and these maybe techniques are new to them? I mean, that is my context, and what we've seen is that there's a certain status quo in any class. And if new students arrive, they kind of just get on with doing whatever the existing students are doing. So if you make this the norm for your class, new students will settle into it and they will learn from their peers, which is lovely. And then the other sort of one was, how about in large classes does this work? And I mean, someone mentioned a class of 75, even more important when you have large classes to ensure that all students know what they're learning and why, so that they can judge their own progress, that they know what their own success looks like, so that they can reflect on that success. Otherwise, how can we really show progress on a large scale? Exactly.
And no teacher in the world has the facility and capacity to give meaningful feedback to 75 students in a class. That's not going to happen. We might kind of fool ourselves and think with a class of 15 that's possible. It's still pretty difficult. But yeah, that's not going to happen in a class like college.
So yeah, the ideas in Overt Teaching can be applied to any context, whether it's online, whether it's in person, whether it's large class, young learners, adult, whatever. You can apply it to your context and help your learners to understand what they're learning, why, and show them progress.
That's the aim.
So Mark, if you had to sum up Overt Teaching in 5 words, what would it be?
I guess probably something like, everyone understands what and why.
I like that. It's nice.
So David, why do you think that every staff room should have a copy of this book?
I think all teachers want to show their students progress in every lesson. And this book has practical ideas that you can apply to any lesson to ensure that happens.